The problem of paradise is that it is not real and it is a true thief, a murderer of anything potentially good in this lifetime. I am quite passionate about this topic, and I believe for good reason. People are just losing their lives, the only lives they're ever going to have, and off such little, if not no evidence, and such bad assertions, such easily falsifiable allegations of who this God is, how he exists, what he wants from us, and what we should be doing with our lives. It's nonsense.
Atheist Creator MindShift has some thoughts about heaven, and I'm going to react right now.
Okay, you don't want to admit that hell is unjust? Fine. Ridiculous, but fine. You want to believe that there is no hell because that makes it easier to accept God's morality? Fine. We can talk about annihilation, or we can talk about universalism, or any of these other things that get us out of the bind of what is, I think, somewhat clear in the New Testament. I'm open to the idea of those concepts being theologically correct. Not that there's any basis for any of them anyway, since this God does not exist.
I know you're an atheist, MindShift. I realize that your internal critique of the Christian faith is not a confession that you actually believe the Bible.
But then let's talk about heaven. Is heaven so great? Is heaven moral? What are the problems with this paradise? And there are many. Now, as a caveat, I should start off by saying there are many different concepts of heaven as well. How funny that we have this one true God, this one true religion, this perfect holy book communicating God's words to us, and yet we can't agree on heaven and hell, the afterlife, the whole pretense to the reason we need to do something in this life in a correct and specific way. That makes a great deal of sense. Anyways,
the basic idea of what we need to know, believe, don't believe, positive afterlife, not so positive afterlife, isn't too fuzzy. The details lead to differences because the Bible's goal is not to tell us everything we want to know about heaven. Just as I'd like to know a lot more about angels, and so I just have to pick up what I learn about angels implicitly from other stories. The truth is the Bible doesn't always want to just tell me everything I want to know about heaven. And so we take what we do know and we speculate a little bit as different theologians and just Christian thinkers and just interested Christians. That might result in some different answers. But so what? Why is God required to tell us everything we'd like to know about a subject? If God doesn't tell us everything we want to know about heaven and we make some guesses that are wrong, that's God's fault. It's not if it's not the goal of God to tell us everything that we would like to know about heaven, and he does tell us as much as is necessary.
Are there different issues in how heaven is perceived? Yes. Some people believe that it is a soul versus an actual spiritual body versus our physical bodies being reincarnated, etc., up into the heavens. That leads to their own set of problems. But I want to major in the majors. I think when most Christians, and I am talking about the Christian heaven here, the biblical heaven, think about heaven, they think about a few things, and I want to throw them out there. Will there be some of you in the comments who are like, well, technically that's not what I think? Fine. I'm majoring in the majors.
Now, notice that he says he's majoring on majors here, and I get that. You can't respond to every little group of Christians and what they think about things, but he didn't exactly say that about hell. In fact, he said,
you want to believe that there is no hell because that makes it easier to accept God's morality? Fine. We can talk about annihilation, or we can talk about universalism, or any of these other things.
So it sounds like what he's saying here is, regardless of whatever your view about hell is, the view of the majority, what he's calling the majority view of heaven, is it's incoherent in some way. So I'm taking him to say there, in responding to him here, he's granting some flexibility in your understanding of hell because he thinks there's some theological possibility there, but not heaven. He's just going to deal with the majority view of heaven. I'm just making sure we've got the groundwork here for what we're going to do going forward.
Most people believe that heaven is eternal. It goes on forever and it does not end. Most people think that they will be in heaven in some physical sense, that we will be able to recognize other people, that there will be food, that there will be places, that there are streets made of gold, that these are physical, tangible realities. We are not just floating in a cloud in perfect bliss. We are actually doing things, mainly worshiping God.
So far I'm down, but I do think that a good deal of this is going to depend on what we understand the term worship to mean.
But there are feasts where we will eat. Supposedly we will have mansions.
This is not too big of a deal, but mansion. D.A. Carson, in his The Gospel According to John, had this to say. Since heaven is here pictured as the Father's house, it is more natural to think of dwelling places within a house as rooms or suites. The simplest explanation is best. My Father's house refers to heaven, and in heaven are many rooms, many dwelling places. The point is not the lavishness of each apartment, but the fact that such ample provision has been made that there is more than enough space for every one of Jesus' disciples to join him in his Father's home. And then, of course, there's some debate about whether the dwelling place is mentioned here, whether it's actually talking about the places that you're going to live in heaven. But regardless, this is just a minor point.
We will have our crowns, all of these other very materialist things. Like, how unimportant would gold be in heaven, right? What would give it its value? It wouldn't be rare. Everything is made of gold there. Are we supposed to remember from our earthly experience on this one particular planet, even though there's probably life on other planets, that gold was a limited resource here for a period of time that made it valuable? Like, how man-made is this concept?
Or maybe it's because it's a symbolic statement about value in an afterlife populated by humans. But he's got a point. He's right. Like, what he's saying, like, what if there's life on these other planets and they have some sort of a salvation thing, and gold isn't a resource of particular interest to them the way we think about it? And so why are we being told about all this gold? It wouldn't quite be fair, or we would expect these, or at least we would expect these alien races, their precious resources, whatever those might be, their equivalent to gold, to also be represented somehow in heaven. And I guess if I go along with that, get my head in that headspace, what I could just say is maybe it is. Maybe whatever their precious resource is also incorporated. But why would you point to that as you're explaining what heaven is going to be like to people in the Earth Bible, the one that we have? The one that we have, we would expect might talk about our precious resources. So if I follow you there, I still think it works out.
But again, I'm giving this to all of you. Let's just assume that the descriptions of heaven are accurate as they are described in the Bible. Let's assume that it goes on forever. Let's assume that there is some sense of us that is still us that is there, and that we will be doing what God says we will be doing, which is being a new creation, having some new perfect body that is able to worship him. And there are things we also don't get. There are no tears, death, sorrow, or sin. Those are 4 things in Revelation that are very clear we do not have in heaven.
Okay, tears, death, sorrow, and sin. And he could have also mentioned pain. No more sorrow, no more pain. And when it comes to death and sin, those are kind of a little bit different than when we look at these other ones that we are mentioned here. When we talk about tears, sorrow, pain, these kinds of things. These seem to be graduated sort of things in a human being. So, for example, when is it pain and when is it not pain? And so what does it mean to say there's no pain? And an equivalent thing could be said about sorrow. So, for example, if I'm sitting in a chair, some chairs are more comfortable than others. So I'm really comfortable, or sometimes I'm less comfortable but still comfortable, or just moderately comfortable, or now I'm not comfortable, now I'm uncomfortable, but it's not pain. I'm not going to call it pain. Then it's maybe a little annoying, and then somewhere it gets to minor pain. And you see, it's like a graduated scale. And we're going to be human beings in heaven. We're going to have a life that we live, and the human experience will just be the perfect human experience. But I think that with these graduated things, like, will I never have the experience of having a hard day's work and have that soreness in my muscles when the day is over? That is somewhat a good, positive, beneficial feeling. Yeah, I think I probably will. And with sorrow, we don't want to. I don't know that we go so woodenly there that we have to believe, and we're going to talk more about this later, like a complete memory wipe of all the bad things in life and all the people that went to hell and all those kind of things. Maybe, but I don't know that that's necessary. I just think we're not going to have despair. We're not going to have a situation of hopelessness, and we will not lack comfort in this new existence. But no more death, yes. And no more sin, yes, but tears. Sometimes they're tears of joy. So I just think we need to take this where we don't make of the heavenly experience something that's obviously not heavenly, even to the person that perhaps was writing it, right? We want to try to get at what is really being described here. But the point is, there will be no ultimate state of despair and death and hopelessness, and where there's no resolution and all of those kinds of things. You'll still be a human being, but you'll be in a world without all of those corrupting things.
So with all of that as our setup, let's cover what I think will end up being about a list of 7 problems. Let's start off simple and with a really easy one. How about just eternal monotony? I'm talking boredom. I'm talking the very first thought most of us had as kids when we heard about heaven. Now, some of our parents told us, oh, it's great, you'll be riding flying horses and eating whatever food you like the best and all of these things. But that's not the reality. Many of us were told about the worship part, that we would endlessly, eternally be worshiping God. Now, maybe some of that are correlating worship incorrectly, and we thought of the praise and worship parts of service at church, and we thought, oh, I don't want to do that forever. Maybe worshiping God is just living perfectly. Maybe that brings glory to him. But the actual descriptions we get of worship are closer to the first one. They are about songs that are sang, instruments that are played, our bodily position of being bent over and bowed down, etc. That does not sound fun. But Brandon, you don't understand. We'll be filled with the light. We'll be filled with God's presence. We'll be right there. We'll be compelled to do nothing else. There will be no greater thing you could do for eternity than praise God. I'm going to skip the narcissistic parts of how ridiculous it is that this God who wants a relationship with us is having an end goal where the vast amount of all time, like if eternity is real, if infinity is a concept and you live 120 years, take it to the max here, it doesn't matter. It's like nothing. It's literally more comparable to zero than any other number. That means that God's intention, his design for all time, is just to have his robotic slaves worshiping him. Why would he need this? Why would he want this? I'm serious. Like if you really zoom out, it makes no sense. And it sounds absolutely awful.
So yes, worship is closely aligned with sacrifice, and sacrifice is to give of yourself in obedience to or for the good of another. That's sacrifice, that's worship. That also involves in the Christian life love in that way, because you're giving of yourself for the good of another or out of obedience or something like that. And yes, in biblical history that involves sacrifices, and it's involved kneeling and praying in corporate worship, and even now singing out loud with your hands up, or kneeling, or even laying prostrate, and all those kinds of things. Yes, that's true. But in the New Testament, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 that you're to be a living sacrifice. And so you live a life of obedience. You live a life out of service to others. And I think you mentioned that someone said to you that to worship God is to do ideally what God wants you to do. And so that's a sense of worship for New Testament believers. And so when we get to heaven, you're going to find both. You're going to find corporate worship, where we are doing something that very much looks like church worship, but you don't have to imagine that you need to bring a back brace because your back's going to be worn out from being bent over so long, and you better bring a magazine or an iPad or something because you're going to get bored. It's not like that. You're going to have corporate worship, but I think we're also going to live very full lives. After all, the Bible talks about, however you understand this, as imagery or not, it talks about streets and all these kind of things that imply that we will go places and we will live fulfilling lives in heaven. At least that's how I understand it. And so I think you'll have the living of the Christian life. You'll live a life of sacrifice for the Lord, and you'll also have corporate worship. I don't see a problem there. Now, as to whether this is arrogant of God to require this, well, he's the creator and this is his creation. And I'm not saying therefore might makes right, but what I am saying is that all of creation will function better when it's oriented toward him. And of course, that's why corporate worship is also particularly important in any place that's worshiping God, right? So the corporate worship is important, and also the living your life of worship, that's also important too.
Talking more on the monotony front, I really believe that something that never ends, right? That we're going to run into a series of repeatable events forever.
Now, he does talk here about how not everyone understands this stuff about infinity. Most people have trouble with it. He includes himself. That was humble. I appreciate that. I certainly have had trouble trying to grapple with it. But he says the more you look into it, the more you realize this problem.
Nothing can go on forever and be a good thing. You'll live every possible occurrence of anything that can be done in heaven, a billion, trillion, quadrillion, Google times a billion times over forever, and it will be just the beginning, just the blink of an eye of how many more times you'll do it again. But that's just a little teaser to get us started. I've already realized that I've mixed kind of points 1 and 2 here, which is monotony and slavery. So let's just kind of combine this, point 1 and 2, and I'll continue to talk about it. Now, a lot of the excuses for this are, again, going back to, but you don't understand, we've never been in the very presence of God. We could spend an eternity worshiping him, and it would be amazing. Well, this then leads to that second point that we've already mixed in a little bit, which is slavery. Okay, so before we get to slavery, let's talk about this eternal boredom in heaven issue. Huge spoiler alert here. Huge spoiler alert for fans of The Good Place. If you like The Good Place, skip ahead like a minute or something. But the best pop culture expression of this that I've seen so far is toward the end of The Good Place, they get to actual heaven,
and they're there, and they begin to realize this problem. And I don't know, I'm probably going to butcher the details, but they've been there for like millions of years or billions of years or something. And the one character, Jason, who's kind of, he's kind of a knucklehead in the show, he wants to play like the perfect game of Madden on Xbox or something. And he finally, after all these years, plays like the perfect game. And then he kind of realizes, I'm ready to like fade out of existence and be done. And different characters begin to have that moment, and they just all begin to fade out of existence because they've this idea, and they may even talk about it explicitly, this notion that you will have experienced every sort of encounter, conversation, idea, joke, moment that you can ever have, like an infinite amount of times. And so boredom will set in. Okay, there's a couple of, so I get the force of that, but there's some things to think about here. Now, it should be said that when we're talking about future infinites here, we're in time going forward, we're talking about always heading forward, always approaching, but never arriving at infinity. You're always heading toward infinity, but you're never going to actually make it because it's infinity, and there'll always be one more day or one more thing or whatever, one more moment of time, however you want to do that. Now, all you really have to do is use a little imagination to come up with some answers to how this could possibly work. Now, first, even if this doesn't completely resolve the concern, I still am not convinced that it doesn't work, that in an always approaching but never arriving at infinity sort of thing, that the Creator could actually continue to create new things for us to experience, enjoy, discuss, write poetry about, create art about, explore, whatever. And he could do that on into the always approaching but never arriving at future infinite time. But though these might sound a little too simplistic or straightforward or whatever, there are actually some pretty straightforward answers to this that one could consider. Perhaps in the presence of God, boredom fades into enlightened contentment, kind of like you mentioned some people expressed to you. Perhaps God simply alters the way we experience boredom. Even more simplistic, maybe God resets your memory all the way back to when you first entered heaven, like once every few trillion years. There are many explanations for how this might work if someone just exercises some imagination. Imagination? You just making stuff up? Now, remember how I said that the Bible doesn't tell us everything we'd like to know about heaven, and so we have to speculate a little bit. That's what I'm doing. But really, I'm actually providing defeaters to the claim that there simply isn't a way around this problem that has been presented.
Heaven sounds like eternal submission, right? Can I choose to leave? That would be question number one. Can I opt out? Can I choose oblivion at some point? Maybe after 2 billion years, I'm just really done with this concept. Can I leave? No, I can't leave. Well, Brandon, it's not so much that you can't leave, it's that God wouldn't have you have the desire to leave. So God's controlling me. God's controlling my mind. God's controlling my will and my desires. He's forcing it. He's compelling it by his very presence. That's slavery. I don't care what positive spin you want to put on it because you've called God a good thing. I'll even, for all of this that we're talking about today, I'm going to entertain the idea that this God is actually somehow good, just, and moral, which is already so problematic, right? But I'm trying to really just think like, okay, you guys are all right. This God is real. Hell doesn't exist. There's oblivion and annihilation and universalism and all of these things. How is heaven going? And the very fact that I have no say in the matter, I have no say that that's the only alternative, right? Like with universalism, or that it's sure, maybe it is better than hell. I'll give you that. But the lesser of two evils doesn't make it beneficial or good. And God forcing it to be good, right? Like if I can't even choose to think how I want to feel about it, to have my own experience, if every single person who's ever lived, think about how different we all are. If we're all going to have exactly perfect, repeatable, and expected outcomes in heaven to experience everything in the exact same way, what's the point? How on earth could we all agree on that without some coercion, some forced manipulation of our will and thought processes and feelings? Oh, we don't have will, thought processes, and feelings, so we are robots. We do have will, thought processes, and feelings. How? Show me how. How can I utilize them in heaven? If I can't think of alternate perspectives, if I can't come up with a better outcome, if there's just nothing different, if it can't end, like, do you guys understand really, really what this would seem like.
Right. So I think that we do have free will in heaven of the sort that I think you're interested in, but we also won't have sin and no one will want to leave. Now, why is that? How do we do that? Well, think about this with me. I have 2 daughters, and when each of them were very small, they each in a sandbox reached down, picked up some sand, and put the sand in their mouth. Now, when they did that, each of them, only after doing it a couple of times, learned that that's not something we want to do. Okay. Now, when they're 35, my oldest daughter, when she's 35, could she reach into a sandbox and pull out sand as a 35-year-old woman, put it in her mouth and swallow it? Yes, she could logically. There's nothing logically preventing her. She could do it. She could perform the mechanics, but it's absurd. She won't do it. And the very idea is absurd, right? Okay, in a similar way, and it's because of what she's seen, what she's learned, what she's experienced, and all those kind of things going back to childhood. In a similar way, what I'm positing here is that in heaven, sin will be like eating sand, including the sin of wanting to leave heaven. That would be like eating sand. It would be like, logically, is there anything preventing it? Theoretically, is it possible? Maybe, but no one ever does it, and the idea itself is absurd. It'd be like eating sand. I think that's a way of kind of getting your mind there and understanding how that is. Now, if you want to say, well, why isn't it that way here already? Well, this is part of the learning process, but also we're going to say more about that in just a few moments. But I want you to understand that on this scenario, you have free will. Now, some Christians do get around this by saying you just won't have free will in heaven. Even some Christians that say you have free will right now, they say, well, you don't have free will in heaven. Some sort of compatibilism would be true. I don't take that approach. I say no. And some people say, well, it's like the reason there won't be sin in heaven or anything is because it's like one thing that's been removed. Like if you took Diet Coke off all the shelves in America, it'd just be one less option. But I don't think that works. And the reason I don't think that works is because sin isn't quite like that. It's not like an object you can remove. It's not even like a teaching that you can remove. It's the moment by moment deciding to live a life that is consistent with what the master wants, is to live a holy life and to do what he wants. And sin would be not doing that. And so it's a moment by moment thing. So I do think that you have free will. And so logically, I guess it's possible, but no one will ever do it. And the idea is absurd. And so I think that kind of takes some of the explanation there. Now, I want to say also this notion that, well, then why didn't we get something like that on earth? And why do we have to go through the whole earth process till death and then get this perfect free will world without sin in heaven? Well, interesting. In Graham Oppy's book, Arguing About Gods, he considers the theological position of Molinism. Now, if you don't know what Molinism is, it has to do with God's awareness of not only all future and past and present events, but what would have been the case under other circumstances. So if free creatures had chosen differently, what other sort of worlds would have been the world, instead of this world? I happen to be a Molinist, and Graham Oppy is thinking about how Molinists might answer this question that we're discussing of how you have sin, pain, and suffering and all that on earth, but then you have, and it has something to do with free will, but then when you get to heaven, there's free will and there's no pain. Like, how does that work? And what he says in Arguing About Gods on page 318 of my copy is, one option here might be to follow the Molinist version of the free will defense developed by Plantinga, 1974, and discussed above. Suppose that there are true counterfactuals of freedom, and that the truth of these counterfactuals of freedom is not something that can just be chosen by a perfect being. For all we know, it is logically possible that when a perfect being comes to create contingent things, it has open to it the option of making a universe in which free creatures freely go wrong, that is conjoined to a heaven. This is the key point. A place where free creatures freely go wrong is conjoined to a heaven in which free creatures always freely go right, but it does not have open to it the option of making a universe in which free creatures always freely go right. Okay? Now, he rejects this position mostly because, if I understand him right, he doesn't accept Molinism for other reasons that are discussed elsewhere. But in terms of this, he says, here's one option. Well, that's my option. I think that option works. So I would like to know some response to that option. And it falls right in line with other positions that I already held, and it works nicely.
And so many of you have justified the version of heaven as being so good because it's so much better than the alternative. But I'd encourage you to really think about if hell didn't exist at all and someone just told you at the end of your life, here's what happens. You go, you get a new body, you don't feel pain anymore, you don't feel sorrow anymore. You're perfect. You're a perfect being. You can't grow. You can't get better at things. You can't develop a new skill or hobby. You can't improve.
But why think that you won't still learn and improve? I don't get this notion. I don't know where it came from. I do agree that it's out there, but that you'll just instantly be omniscient and sort of maxed out whenever you get to heaven. And for those Christians who see it like me, no tears, no sorrow in heaven means no despair, no hopelessness, no lack of comfort. But it doesn't mean that I'm always on like the highest comfort extreme setting.
And your entire existence is simply to shout over and over, holy, holy is the name.
No. There's obviously corporate worship in heaven, but Christian worship is corporate, and it's also in terms of your daily living a life of sacrifice for God. So you're going to have both aspects of that.
Is that something you would willingly sign up for?
I might not sign up for some of the ways that you described it, but the way that as I look at what I think I have as information or evidence or reasons to believe these things, and I put it all together and I think that through, I like that, the conclusion I think I come to with that, which is what I'm trying to express in this video. Yeah, I look forward to that.
And don't just say yes because you're still afraid of death or you're still afraid of hell and you're not sure what happens in the afterlife, so at least this one doesn't have any pain in it, right? Like, are you just choosing it because it is, again, the lesser of two evils? Or does this make any sense at all? And if you really, no consequences, had the option to just stop existing after a certain amount of time, wouldn't that be preferable? Wouldn't you like to at least reserve that as an option? I think if anyone is honest, then they would. And if you're so caught up in your feelings and your emotions and the glory and presence of God that you can't have those faculties, then you are no longer you anyways. You are indeed a slave robot. You can't have it both ways.
Remember what we said about my daughter eating sand when she's 35, like with the sand addiction? From what she knows and what she's experienced, she logically could do it, but she never will, and the idea is absurd. Right? So in heaven, logically, could someone perform an action that would amount to a sin or string a series of phrases together that would amount to some sinful speech or something? I imagine it's logically possible, but no one ever would. It's absurd. It's like eating sand. And the same would be true about your desire to leave. Like, yeah, I guess you could, but with what you'll know, it's absurd. It's like eating sand. So yeah, you're free, but also there'll be no sin.
You're somehow an individual in heaven. You still get to pursue your passions and hobbies. How? First of all, the Bible doesn't even tell us that we can do that. Second of all, if we can't be sad, then we can't ever have messed up, right? Like if I want to get really good at wood carving and I mess up, what does that look like in heaven? What does a mistake look like in heaven? How can one learn? How can someone improve? Again, like the concepts here, the philosophical ideology of what heaven's issues are endless.
Well, I think if you go with the articulation that I've tried to put forward so far, you get development, you get the human experience, and you get a perfect world.
And let's just say I'm wrong about so many of these facets that I don't think I can be wrong about, and we do get to grow in heaven, and we do actually excel, and there are layers to this. Well, that's going to lead to some unfairness problems, which I'm going to cover here in a few points. But before that, still, to what end? We're talking about eternity. I can only do so many hobbies. Like, do you understand everything that you can ever imagine is finite? We have a finite amount of things we can be interested in or do. We have a finite amount of times we can do them before we lose interest. We have a finite amount of growth that we can do in any particular subject. This simply doesn't work.
Yeah, but now I've offered some defeaters to that I think make sense as possibilities.
Eternity is never going to be a good thing, no matter how you spin it. I don't want to live forever. I honestly do not believe there is any good version of heaven. If it's a choice and I get to talk to some creator at the end of all of this, I don't care who the creator is or what his plan or her plan or its plan is for an afterlife. I would honestly prefer at some point, maybe I want to check it out for 500 years, but at some point, I want the option to not exist, to not be conscious, to not participate.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you can make that choice this side of heaven, but I don't want you to, obviously. And look, I don't think you have to see this the way that you're seeing it for reasons I've already discussed. But also on this particular point, it could be a much more, I think, adult version of what I call the candy in heaven mistake. And the candy of heaven mistake is when the kid asks, well, is there going to be candy in heaven? So I don't know. No, maybe there's no candy in heaven. which I don't know who would know that to say no, but let's say you say no, the kid thinks, well, it's not going to be heaven. If there's no candy, it won't be heaven. I'm not going if there's no candy. I don't want to be a part of this heaven if there's no candy. Well, obviously, as we get older, we understand that that's a little bit silly. And then we get to be teenagers, and every teenage Christian thinks, well, okay, is there going to be sex in heaven? Because I'm hearing this thing about we'll be like the angels and all that. And if there's no sex, how can it be heaven? Sex is like the greatest thing, right? And that's a little bit kind of also the candy mistake. And maybe as you ratchet it up, this idea that I don't get to just choose to not exist anymore whenever I want, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to that, because I understand that there are philosophical ideas about an infinite future that can kind of be terrifying in a certain respect. But it could be like the candy. If I don't get to die when I decide it's time, like the people on The Good Place, or just fade into non-existence or whatever, then it's not going to be heaven. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. Plus, we've offered some answers that I think will help with that.
This leads us to point 3, which is the free will issue. This is probably, honestly, one of the top 2 issues with heaven. Okay, so once again, we can't cry, we can't suffer, we can't feel pain, we can't die, etc. All of these things, again, straight from Revelation. So, are we good in heaven? Yeah, we're the epitome of good. We're as moral gets. Okay, so I can't suffer, and I am good. I'm good all the time. Everything I do and say is good, because it has to be, because otherwise it might bring suffering to me or to other people. It could bring sadness. It could bring sin. There's no sin in heaven. If there's no sin in heaven, then there's 100% only good moral things according to God. That right there 100% means there's no free will in heaven, because that is the entire defense for why we must have free will on earth.
This is where I would cast your mind back to the sand eating analogy again, and the Graham Oppy scenario that he suggested that actually fits my positions really well.
Now, I'm not the first to make this point, but maybe you haven't heard it, or maybe you've excused it, and I'm going to really ask you to consider this point if you claim to be a believer. Why does God let bad things happen? Well, you don't understand. It's not really God doing it or letting it happen here on earth, Brandon. He had to allow free will. We have to understand pain to understand pleasure. We have to be able to reject him so that he doesn't force us. God wouldn't want us just to be robots, okay? And that's the excuse for all of the atrocities on this earth. And if you really are too historically ignorant or too in your bubble to understand the realities of the horror of this world and of the history of this world, to think that that is somehow a justifiable excuse, I feel sorry for you.
I get it. I feel the force of arguments from evil, and you're clearly impressed with them, and I understand why. But there are like a couple of things in this kind of what we would call theodicy that are getting mixed together that we could parse out. So there is the idea that God created a world that he knew would have evil in it, because experiencing evil, that he could then redeem something good out of that. It would build our moral character and integrity. So that is one answer. And I do think that's true. I think most of these responses would have to be multifaceted. Okay. But I think that's one explanation. That's something good God brings out of it. But I think the ultimate engine behind it is the second thing that we talked about here, which is the free will issue. But really the way that I think we should conceive of this is more that, okay, the Bible says that God wants us to love our neighbor as ourselves, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself, right? That's what he wants. And it all boils down to love, right? Well, how do you get the highest expression of love? I would argue, and I'm prepared to argue, that it's love that is freely given. Okay, so then to have the highest expression of love, you would have a world with creatures that have free will. For those that need to know, libertarian free will is what I'm thinking of, but you'd have a world of free creatures that way. But even if you're God, if you create a world of free creatures, you have to live with the reality that they're going to use that freedom for both good and for evil. And so as a result of that, what we end up with is you have a world where you have evil and pain and suffering in it, but you also have the highest expression of love. So those are two kind of related but separate things.
There is a concept of us being able to be perfectly moral and still experiencing joy and worshiping God and having connection with him, having communion with him, and all of the things that God wants from us without sinning, without suffering. And it's actually the plan for the majority of our existence ever when you consider eternity. So why have these 100 years of suffering, pain, and death for everyone? It makes no sense. You cannot have your cake and eat it too on this one. To be very clear, if there is sin in heaven, it's not heaven. It's not perfect. If there can't be sin in heaven, that means something is controlled, either our desire or our will, our ability. A lot of people will say, Brandon, again, you don't understand. In the presence of God, you won't want to sin. That is such a cop-out. Then why doesn't God share his presence with us here on earth? Well, because it would rob you of your free will. So his presence does rob us of free will. This is just beyond simple to me. Earth is 100% unnecessary because we are always going to end up in heaven with a God that is controlling us, where he does not allow for the bad things and yet still somehow provides the pleasurable things.
Unless no one freely chooses to sin in actuality. And as Oppie's suggestion shows, God perhaps could choose to actualize a world in which freely no one sins in heaven because of the experience of this sinful world. So no, the conclusion is unnecessary.
So if it is a good thing that can exist without all of the bad things, make this make sense to me. This is honestly one of my biggest problems, not just with the concept of heaven, but with all of the belief system in God in general, mainly because it ties to my connection with the problem of evil or the problem of suffering, and the indefensible excuse of free will completely falls on its face when you consider the realities and the setup of heaven according to the Bible.
Respectfully, and I do mean that, I mean respectfully, according to your presentation of what the Bible has to say, but not at all according to mine. Now, he has some other points here that we could go over, but the answers given so far serve as answers for some of those things too, I think, except for two things. Let's knock those out.
Here's a question. Will you still have your memories from this time on earth in heaven? I doubt it, and here's why. Once again, that verse in Revelation provides us with so much ammunition. There are no tears, death, sorrow, or sin. How much sorrow do you have when you think about your life? You might have the best life ever. You might have every single thing that provides you with meaning and purpose and beauty in your life. And I bet when you think through your memories, you are filled with sorrow. And then again, whatever age you are as you're listening to this, imagine being at the end of your life, right? Whenever that life ends, you don't think you'll have ever had any regrets. You don't think you'll ever have anyone that you miss. What about the people who don't know God and they're in hell or oblivion or whatever? They're not with you. If you have a memory of them, if you have a concept of who you were and what you did on this earth and the people you hurt and the people that you hurt that can't be in heaven because they didn't think or were convinced of the right thing, how do you think that's going to go? You simply cannot be able to have these memories, this same conscious continuum. So what is your identity in heaven? How are you recognizing people? How are you holding on to your past? Because to hold on to your past at all, to be the same person, like this is a really fun kind of ship of Theseus kind of philosophical thought experiment here. To what degree are you still you if God has to rob you of some part of yourself, some part of your desire, some part of your will, some part of your nature, some part of your memory, some part of your previous existence, right? To really be able to ensure no tears, death, sorrow, or sin, you are being manipulated into some newer creation. And to what extent can you have that done until you are no longer yourself? I believe it would happen almost immediately. It would break down. You would almost immediately have to be considered something entirely new. And for God to work all these things out, I think he's going to have to rob you of entirely who you were.
Now, you might not be convinced, but as far as I can tell, there are two issues at least that are powerfully influential in answering this question. And that is one, how do we understand no sorrow? And number two is what idea of hell do we have in mind? So do we need a memory wipe of at least the lost people in our lives or the bad memories or whatever else it is, sinful things and all that? Do we need a memory wipe? Well, when we say no sorrow, we're talking about no despair, no hopelessness, no lack of comfort there, but not this extreme literal, like you won't ever have you won't ever think of something sad or anything like that. Then we're not required to talk about a memory wipe here. And since he is allowed for any understanding of hell, like say someone took the annihilationist perspective, well, then they could at least at some point, the person in heaven could at least say about their loved one, they're not suffering at least anymore, like they do about people right now that are passed away, and yet they go on to live fulfilling lives. I'm not saying that that's easy. I don't want to downplay that. We're just talking about the nuts and bolts of it here. But even if we go the other way and we had a memory wipe, and we're talking about this ship of Theseus sort of thing, but with memory, I'm not so sure we can be so cavalier about that. Like, what if I get hit in the head and I forget my old phone number from the house I used to live at, not my childhood house, but the one 2 houses ago. And I've lived in a bunch of houses. Okay, I forget that phone number. Am I a different person now? I mean, come on, I forgot something. I'm still, and I'm definitely, I think, still the same conscious experiencer of what is happening. So even with the loss of memories, even important memories, I'm not totally convinced. But then again, I don't think we have to have the memory wipe anyway.
One of the sickest answers I've heard is that when we are in heaven and we are so filled with the presence of God, we will delight even in our loved ones burning in hell.
I know. Yeah, people say weird things.
Think about the layers of unfairness that are going to exist in heaven. What is the point of a physical reward in heaven if you can't feel better about it than what someone else has? Like, think about this for a second. If there's no suffering in heaven, there's no sadness in heaven, then the person here who did not achieve this, they don't know what they're missing. They can't comprehend that. And the person who has this has no reason to enjoy it more than the person down here. Like, do you guys understand that? So what happens about the unreached people group that get reached, and there's an 80-year-old man in the tribe, and he hears about Jesus from some missionary, and he accepts it right there, and he does one good deed, and then bam, he dies. Now he's in heaven, no fault of his own. He's the lowest tier in heaven. And that's it for infinity. Right? Like, that's insane.
So I don't know too many Christians who sit around worrying about this too much. Like with me, when I'm in heaven, I'm just going to be thrilled. I'm just going to be thrilled that I'm there, man. And I think most people think that way. Didn't you think that way when you were a Christian? I just think that I'm going to be thrilled that I'm there. But really, again, with respect, all I hear here is that you don't like or agree with some aspect of how this might work, if you're understanding it right, but that doesn't an argument make.
The problem with paradise is that it's not real. It is a hypothetical trade. You are trading today, this life, these next however many decades you get. The only thing that is guaranteed to you, because I don't care what you believe, I don't care how many near-death experience stories have convinced you, the only thing you can 100% know is that you are here now experiencing what you are experiencing, creating the life that you are creating.
When I recorded this yesterday, I should have included a segment in which MindShift talks about Christians treating others badly because of their focus on heaven rather than this life. Families have fallen apart because of disagreements over worldview. I simply agree with MindShift that believers should not treat unbelievers poorly. I also agree that Christians often do treat them poorly. I predict this will sound too easily stated because what amounts to treating others poorly requires nuance. But I agree with the sentiment he gives in this video. We should not cut people off because they deconverted or disagree with us on something.
That's it. That's all you get. And you are going to trade that, the only sheer thing, for a completely hypothetical possibility.
Listen, I preach toward the end of my videos every now and then, so this is not a criticism here, but there is kind of an exhortation, a sermonic appeal as he's reaching this point. But he does, like, in doing that, he kind of presumes the very thing that is up for discussion here with statements like, this is the only life you get. It's nonsense. I don't care how many near-death stories convinced you. Well, okay. But if you don't care about the near-death stories that convinced me, then I'm not going to get any response to those near-death stories. And I didn't hear a response to near-death stories now. And I know that's not what this video is about. I'm just making a point. And trade my life, like, well, you're going to trade your life and the only life you... Okay, but I mean, you say that like it's a bad thing. Like, even if I found out tomorrow that Christianity was false, I would still think that I have lived a very fulfilling life. It's provided a lot of enrichment and inspiration and all of those kind of things. It's probably kept me out of making some seriously bad choices that I would have made, knowing myself. Yeah. So I mean, I traded, but I feel like it was a good trade. I love talking about heaven and thinking about how it all might work out. But my main thing with this was it presented itself kind of with the force of being kind of like a debunking type video. And I don't think it accomplished a debunking. What I do think it was a list of interesting topics for discussion and for, exploring and jumping in and thinking about how all this might work. And as far as that goes, it was an interesting video because of that for me. The important thing is not just that we're going to heaven, but also becoming a part of a kingdom. And it's all about Jesus. Jesus made this possible because we can be saved from our sins. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans chapter 10 and verse 9 says, if you'll confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, you will be saved. So it's a public thing. We're not to be ashamed about this, but it's also a way that you live your life. You really do believe on these things. And the Bible says that you're to repent. That means to turn from your life without Jesus to a life with Jesus. And you do that by confessing that, yes, I have committed some sins, Lord. I repent of my life of sin and I'm turning to you. I'm going to commit my life to you going forward. And if you do that, I hope that you'll let me know about it. But listen, I made another response to MindShift in the past, so that's where you need to head next.